Today, we're digging into a really fascinating analysis that looks at the EU's economic sanctions against Russia and asks a pretty provocative question. Could these sanctions end up being self-destructive? Right off the bat, the source material does not pull any punches. It uses this powerful Italian word, scellerate, which means wicked or foolish, to describe the EU's choices. So from the very beginning, it's setting this incredibly critical tone, arguing these decisions could threaten the very heart of Europe's financial stability. And that really gets to the core question of the whole analysis. These sanctions were designed as a weapon against Russia, but could they maybe accidentally be pointed right back at Europe's own economy? Let's walk through how they make that argument.
Okay, so first up, let's get our heads around what the paper even means when it uses a term as strong as kamikaze sanctions.
According to the paper, these aren't just your standard economic penalties. They're defined as a super high-risk strategy, one where the potential damage to Europe's own economic well-being wasn't really factored in properly against the geopolitical goals. It's all about that risk of self-harm. And you can see just how much this strategy has escalated over time. It started back in 2022, and by late 2025, it had just snowballed into 19 separate packages. The scope got wider and wider, too, eventually hitting things like third-party banks and even crypto. Now, all of this led to a really surprising and, on the surface, a pretty great side effect: a huge financial windfall for some European companies. But, as you can see from the subtitle, this profitable situation, it comes with a hidden catch. First, let's just take a second to absorb the scale here. We are talking about a massive amount of money, roughly 300 billion euros in Russian state assets that are currently frozen and just sitting in European financial institutions. But here's the crazy part. Because these assets are frozen, not actually seized, they're still generating interest, a lot of it. For just one key institution, Euroclear, this turned into a staggering 4.4 billion euro profit in 2024 alone. The paper argues this huge profit is creating a kind of false sense of security, masking a much deeper risk. And that brings us to the problem. That massive windfall did not go unnoticed, and it triggered what the analysis calls the first domino in a really dangerous chain reaction. Russia decided to fight back. The source paper shows that Russia is being very active here. This isn't just talk. They're using their own court system to win huge $100 million judgments against firms like Euroclear. They're threatening to grab Western assets that are still in Russia, and they're even raising the possibility of cyber attacks on the very financial systems holding their money. So the key takeaway here is that this isn't some abstract geopolitical game. Russia's counteroffensive is laser-focused on a very specific and systemically crucial company, putting a core piece of Europe's financial plumbing under some serious and growing strain. Which, of course, leads to the big question the paper is trying to answer. What happens if that pressure just becomes too much? How does a problem for one single company turn into a crisis for everybody? To really get the risk, we need to quickly talk about what a CSD is. The easiest way to think about it is like the secure warehouse and the master bookkeeper for the whole financial market. It's the essential, invisible plumbing that makes everything work. And because of that, institutions like Euroclear are considered too big to fail. So the analysis lays out this potential vicious circle. Here's how it could play out. It starts with those legal losses from Russian courts eating away at a CSD's capital. That might push the EU to escalate and just seize the assets for good. Well, that could trigger even bigger retaliation from Russia and cause other countries to pull their money out of Europe, fearing they could be next. All it would take then is one trigger event, like a major cyber attack or a credit downgrade, to cause a total collapse in confidence, the failure of the CSD, and a massive shockwave across the entire global economy. All right, so this is where the analysis connects all this high-level systemic risk directly to regular people. Why should you care if some company you've never heard of is in trouble? What does any of this mean for your money? This part is fascinating because it highlights something most of us just never think about. We all assume we directly own our stocks and bonds, right? But the paper explains that in reality, what most of us have is something called a security entitlement. It's basically a contractual IOU. The actual assets are held at the end of a long chain of banks and brokers, with a CSD like Euroclear right at the top. And here's the chilling part. If that CSD were to fail, the law is set up to prioritize secured creditors. We're talking big banks, major financial players. They get paid first from whatever is left. The paper warns that this could mean the claims of individual investors, people like you and me, could get wiped out. So the bottom line is pretty stark. The potential fallout isn't just a headache for Wall Street or London, it's a direct threat to the pension funds, retirement accounts, and personal savings of millions of ordinary people who have their money tied up in this system. Okay, so after painting that pretty dire picture, the paper doesn't just leave us there. It actually finishes by suggesting several potential off-ramps, ways to get out of this situation and lower the risk before it's too late. It lays out 4 possible paths forward. First, there are immediate policy changes, like maybe revising the sanctions to be more targeted. Second, you could strengthen the legal protections for these CSDs agents. A third idea is to just tax those huge windfall profits to pay for aid instead of seizing the assets themselves. And finally, there's a bigger, long-term idea, using new tech like blockchain to let people actually own their assets directly, bypassing this whole complex system. And so in the end, the analysis leaves us with this one big thought to chew on. It's really urging a shift in thinking, to stop seeing these sanctions as just a simple weapon and start seeing them as a complex financial instrument, one with huge built-in risks that absolutely have to be managed very, very carefully.